Good morning, and welcome to the Reynolds Center for American Art and Portraiture. Today's Lunder Conservation Program on conserving and exhibiting the works of Nam June Paik is a special opportunity for us to share expert knowledge gained through research and experience. All disciplines of the American Art Conservation Department worked on the Nam June Paik Global Visionary Exhibition. It has been an incredibly rewarding experience because we have learned about the artist from our own experience with objects, as well as from our discussions with Curator Jon Hanhardt and Associate Curator Michael Mansfield, Estate Curator Jon Huffman, and Estate Executor Ken Hakuda. Our work on the exhibition was rather unique since many objects from the Nam June Paik archive have been included. I would like to recognize the outstanding efforts of Registrar Lynn Putney in managing the acquisition of the Paik archive. The history of acquiring and cataloging the archive was shared in a presentation this year at the annual meeting of the American Institute for Conservation. In addition to thanking Lynn, we would also like to recognize Hannah Freeman-Pacious and Claire Auger-Denny, who continue to conscientiously address the proper storage and thorough cataloging of Paik archive materials. All of this work was made possible through the generous funding received through a series of Smithsonian collection care and preservation grants, totaling a little over $400,000. Today's program has been designed to incorporate a number of case studies regarding the conservation and exhibition of artworks by Nam June Paik. We are delighted to have so many experts in our museum field here today presenting and in the audience. In keeping with the theme of Nam June Paik Global Visionary, we invited colleagues from across the country, mostly from museums, as well as the Nam June Paik Estate and Electronics Arts Intermix. For a global perspective, we asked Anne Goodyear, co-director of Bowdoin College Museum of Art, to present an overview of the initiatives in the preservation of time-based media. Anne was, until very recently, a curator here at the National Portrait Gallery. It was through Anne's initiative, knowledge, and enthusiasm that the Smithsonian Time-Based Media Art Working Group began and has been so successful. The group is a pan-institutional and cross-disciplinary body dedicated to the dissemination and sharing of information about the acquisition, conservation, installation, and exhibition of time-based and digital art amongst Smithsonian administrative units. The Time-Based Media Art Working Group is part of the Smithsonian's Consortia for Understanding the American Experience and the Consortia for World Cultures. This group has helped sponsor the program today, and we're very grateful for their support. Of course, today's program certainly would not have happened were it not for the hard work of my colleague Chris Weiner, Program Coordinator for the Lunder Conservation Center. Chris and I would like to thank our interns and colleagues from the Conservation Department of the American Art Museum and the National Portrait Gallery for volunteering to help with today's program. In particular, we wish to thank Allie Jessing, Joint Program Coordinator for the National Portrait Gallery and American Art Museum, and also the now Principal Investigator of the Time-Based Media Working Group, for her assistance in organizing all the events today. Lastly, I want to share that last night at about 5 p.m., I received a phone call from Ken Hakuda. I missed it, so I had to listen to voicemail. Ken is the nephew of Nam June Paik, and he wrote a beautiful essay in the catalog about his relationship with his uncle. And Ken said that he was sorry he couldn't be here because he's traveling, but he wished us a very successful symposium. And I would just like to mention that Ken has been very supportive of all the museum staff here in thanking us for our efforts in putting up the exhibition and maintaining the archive. A few housekeeping notes. We will be recording today's program. And during the question and answer periods, we do have microphones that are posted in the auditorium but will circulate. And also just, let me see, in case of an emergency, which I hope we don't have, you can exit by the doors that you enter to the back of the auditorium, or you can follow staff through a backstage exit. And there are restrooms located in the foyer of this auditorium. And lastly, we have excellent wireless signals in here, so please silence cell phones because people can find you. So our first talk of the day will be delivered by Curator Jon Hanhardt, Senior Curator for Media Arts here at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Jon Hanhardt has a long career devoted to representing film and the media arts in museum exhibition, collection, and archival programs. He began his career at the Department of Film at the Museum of Modern Art and went on to establish the film program and film study collection at the Walker Art Center. In 1974, he was appointed curator and head of the Film and Video Department at the Whitney Museum of American Art, where he directed the New American Film and Video series, which featured independent film and video art, as well as commissioning art projects and expanding the museum's collection to include video installation art. In 1982, he organized Nam June Paik, a retrospective exhibition. In 1996, he joined the Guggenheim Museum as senior curator of film and the media arts, developing its international exhibition program as well as video installation art collection. He was curator of the exhibition The Worlds of Nam June Paik in 2000. Since 2006, he has been consulting senior curator for media arts at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, where he is developing exhibitions, collections, and archives in film and the media arts. Jon is curator of the current exhibition upstairs, which I hope you see if you haven't already, Nam June Paik, Global Visionary. Jon?
Thank you, Tiarna, and it's a great pleasure to be here. And I just want to echo what was just said about the resources and staff effort here at the Smithsonian American Art Museum and throughout the Smithsonian Institution. It's an extraordinary place, and it's really made possible the preservation and consideration of the extraordinary archive and the expansion of the representation of time-based art in the history of American art. So I'm delighted to be part of this adventure. And I know part of what we're looking at is the representation of Nam June's work in museums around the world and the issues of a new generation of curator interested in representing that work in exhibitions. And as we look to the issues surrounding and informing the conservation of Nam June Paik's artwork, which really has an impact on, obviously, the collections and exhibition initiatives of museums, I would like, in my remarks, to reflect on the scope and complexity of Paik's art and ideas. Now, I've taken as the title of my talk, Permanence and Change, the art and ideas of Nam June Paik. And it argues for the twin interests of permanence and change being in dialogue, I would say a kind of struggle with each other in Paik's work and thinking. It thus recognizes, I hope, a tension, what I would call a creative tension, in Paik's open process of thought and experimentation. Now, an openness that opens that artist to the world around him. And that's part of what the title of the exhibition, Global Visionary, is, how this Korean-born artist traveled the world and living in various places and really experiencing the world at large. And I think as I proceed, I hope that those issues of that travel and interest and exploration, how they shape and inform issues that we have to look at, or that you have to look at as conservators, to his work. Now, I took the title of my talk from a book by Kenneth Burke, whose writings remind one, I think, of Paik's own dazzling connections and ideas and thought processes, and the powerful role both Burke and Paik give to metaphor. And Burke writes how metaphor is revealing of hitherto unsuspected connectives, which we may note in the progressions of a dream. It exemplifies, Burke notes, relationships between objects which our customary rational vocabulary has ignored. Well, I think a wonderful description of Paik's working methods in expanding and breaking outside of the confines of specific ways of thinking about objects. And really an example of this strategy for me is, of connectives and metaphor, is TV Garden from 1974. On view in the exhibition, it's really the centerpiece to the show, where connections between growth and technology, the spread of ideas, the organic, and the technological are all linked by Namjoon. TV Garden, where Paik connects growing plants and expanding television culture, and begins with the opening statement of Global Groove, the single-channel videotape that becomes an installation tape at the heart of TV Garden. It says at the beginning, imagine a future when TV Guide is as thick as a Manhattan telephone directory. Now, the profuse expansion of television is a model here for the empowering possibilities of video in all of its forms as we see it in Namjoon's work. I mean, all of the variety of forms is to empower this medium, to make it into a creative instrument and an art form, and television. Again, I think that we have to all recognize television. It was very important to Namjoon in his own thinking about the medium. It was a way that he worked with his television projects, and he saw his videotapes as going onto television, so that he saw television as an artist medium, as, again, an extension, instrumental extension of this medium. So in looking at Namjoon's, I think if we're looking at Namjoon's videotapes is where we can see demonstrated how they took on a variety of versions and uses. This is how Namjoon worked. And Paik worked with, and I'd like to focus a bit on the videotapes because he worked with a variety of editors, the people that he collaborated with. I would identify, just as introduction, of John Godfrey at the TV Lab at WNET TV, later Paul Guerin, each of them bringing something to that process as Namjoon worked with them to edit and transform his tapes. He worked with composers and musicians, as we know, from David Berman to the band Bad Brains, as well as employing signature pop tunes. Mitch Ryder's Devil with a Blue Dress On became a signature in his work as he reused it, and performers, of course, from Charlotte Moorman to David Bowie, as well as bringing in the work of filmmakers from Jonas Mekas to Ed Emschuler. So Paik really remixed footage on the Paik Abe video synthesizer, this landmark instrument that he created to transform the electronic moving image, as he was adding new material to his masterful videotape, single-channel videotapes, from Guadalcanal Requiem, 1977, to Living with the Living Theater, 1989. A selection of these tapes is on view in the exhibition. I think they're really key. Again, often we don't look closely enough at the single-channel videotapes in terms of looking at the entire body of Namjoon's work. These videotapes, though, also, as I've mentioned, became a source for animating his sculptures and installations. It's very important to see the videotapes. I just want to mention this in terms, again, of issues that we can see echoed in the installations because of the content of the tape, how he's looking at history, politics, global culture, movements of peoples and ideas, and as he used them then in his installation sculptures and various initiatives. And I was recently at the Whitney Museum meeting with Richard Bloss and Reinhard Beck and Christine Fronert, and who we'll be hearing from this afternoon, the fantastic work they're doing on the pyramid. And it just reminded me when I sat there and was looking at the base of this fantastic sculpture, which, the moving image, the videotapes, how they're positioned in terms of the monitor's placement, but also their content. And because, you know, it's one of those situations where we often look at this work as stills in books, you know, illustrating these installations, but we're not seeing is that moving image. We're not seeing how it changes. That was part of the composition. We're not seeing how it changes in terms of sound, because that was another element. And I think it's it's fascinating, and I think it really needs examination as to how these videotapes changed and were used and sourced in his various works. I mean, Global Groove, which I've already mentioned from 1973, is a great example. It's one of his seminal single-channel videotapes, and I'm going to show here what I call some interesting move in terms of how Paik is working. Here he is in the studio recording Charlotte Moorman with a TV bra for living sculpture and the cello in the TV studio. And that then becomes footage that is then synthesized into Global Groove. Excerpt from Global Groove. Those of you who see TV Garden or look at the selection of videotapes will recognize how Paik using his synthesizer to remix that performance. But the development of the piece in terms of we've seen her perform the TV show, synthesized into the videotape. That videotape then becoming, as I've mentioned, the centerpiece to TV Garden shows this move of Paik's tapes into different iterations, into different circumstances, because as I mentioned earlier, this was very expressive of the ideas that were in that tape, this installation. Now, I want to show next a couple of pages from a shot analysis of Global Groove that was prepared by Anja Ostwald. She's a German media scholar and was translated and published in the catalog for Paik's One Artist exhibition, Global Groove 2004, at the Deutsche Guggenheim, Berlin. I show this because it's a really fine example of how she, in doing a shot analysis, brings issues of, I know it's impossible to read, but trust me, I'll just give a little, identify what's going on here. This identifies scenes and sequence, then the image manipulation, the nature of the image manipulation, music that's being used, and then spoken text as it's introduced at various points because this is all timed out, and captions in which where language is printed into the production, and its duration here. So for me, it's essential, I think, that we do closely acknowledge and shot analyses of the tapes, to follow the sections and movements of footage in the tapes and then on to other tapes, analyzing how quotes from his own work were remixed, as we saw with Charlotte Moorman, and another example is here, Merce by Paik. Merce dancing in this virtual space that became a single channel videotape, but he also mixed Merce into Video Fish, in which these are a line of monitors that are behind a fish tank. Each of these is a fish tank, and with fish, which we had to keep alive and take care of. Very important. This is the entry to the 4th floor of the Whitney Museum, 1982. And, but again, it's Nam June playing with this idea of the real and the virtual, looking, the fish tank becomes a TV, the TV becomes a fish tank, because there he would edit in fish flying with airplanes and Merce dancing into the tapes. And so again, it's this expansion and the integration of various video elements into these installations. Now, Namjoon worked inside and outside his studio, and his transformation of media and materials was a working out of ideas and goals that resulted in multiple outcomes. kind of restless in his quest to work on the edge. He was not settled at any point. He was always investigating and transforming. In other words, his efforts to transform media would follow diverse paths and break out of or into a variety of forms. Now, and I'd just like to suggest that we see this early on. Here is his performance piece, one of my favorite images, from Bagatelle Americaine in 1962 as part of the Neo-Dada in der Musik in Düsseldorf performance. And here we see Namjoon playing with a record player, phonograph record player, audio tape, objects and noisemakers in the context of Wolf Fostel, in the context of this fantastic performance. But his direct manipulation of the material of the record, his direct engagement with the technology of the record player as well as the tape and tape player was 1 year later to result in his show at the Gallery Parnasse, 2 versions of his random access with audio tape, the head of the audio tape player being removed, and then as it's rubbed over the audio tape, releasing the sound that's recorded there. And here we see at the Guggenheim, Namjoon with random access in 2000, playing with it. And again, a piece that's now in the collection of the Guggenheim Museum. And also on view here in the exhibition is random access Schallplattenschachteln with records, so that here is Wolf Fostel directly playing the arm of the record player over the records in this arrangement. As you said, you can see it, but can't play with it. Conservation. Upstairs. So again, taking apart this instrument. And so I think that there's very interesting how he moves from performance, engagement with materials, then it becomes located in objects. And I think it's interesting, it's important to understand this kind of genealogy to what you're dealing with in conservation. So by extension, his reworking of the television set in that same exhibition at the Gallery Parnasse showed his breakthrough joining of audio and dismantling and transformation of the electronic medium of television. And here he is with both audio tape and videotape, a direct engagement with that instrument, with that television set, with what's on the screen. And just as a footnote, this very interesting image of German media artist Goetz, who Paik had a lot of dialogue with. So, you know, as one learns more about him and at different points in his career, one learns about the influences and ideas, as we're seeing this in the archive. You know, a book material that he was looking at on waveforms, computer printouts that we have from the 70s and 60s. So these are sources, further sources to looking at his way of working with ideas and materials. So Paik's art was about process as he charted ideas and methods through his artworks, and each of which was what I like to call intertextually developed in different versions of a piece, as well as articulated through different modalities and media and methods. Thus, for example, and I would like to look at the issue of projection here with here is Zen for Film from 1964, about half an hour's worth of clear leader, projected, picking up, as he said when I was showing it at the Guggenheim, he said, be sure to drop it on the floor and make sure it gets dirty, because it's those granular, the material, the debris it picks up and projects. And I've also seen this as interesting. For me, this was an insight about how Namjoon is making film, the recorded medium of film, live, interactive, if you will, because it's constantly changing in the process of its projection and in the process of its change in that projection. Now, he also pushed early forms of projection. This is Imagine there are more stars on the sky than Chinese on Earth. It's from 1981. It's a photograph that from the Whitney exhibition. It's largely really important to go back to these shows to see what was shown. This is toward the back of the gallery, fourth floor space. And this is an early form of projection. You see how he was manipulating it, projecting it early on up to the ceiling, creating this arc of the stars, the moons, in what, again, was a very early projective form of dealing with video. And then his laser projection, this is Laser Video Space 2 from 1981, again part of that 1982 exhibition at the Whitney Museum. This is done in collaboration with Horst Baumann, very interesting German laser artist. And this was a system where the moving images, tapes, projected by laser, when they would move through a crystal, would disperse, and everywhere the laser would touch, the image would be reconstituted. So essentially, he eliminated the television set and transformed the walls into pulsating, moving images. And but again, it's a form of projection, as we see here also with the Boyce projection from 1990, treatment of his recorded live performance that was shot when they performed together in Tokyo, and then how he projected and layered it with the projectors onto the surface, onto the wall. And here, a version of candle projection from at the Guggenheim exhibition. I just love this installation. Again, where the live candle is being projected and layered with the projectors is laid out on the floor, so it goes right back to his early work, creating this vibrant moving image that's not recorded, it's live. It's using closed circuit. So here again, this expansion of the projection. I have a lot to say, but I'll rush this around. It's also important to look at his writings, and I think where media and technologies were tested through language and a speculative fusing of philosophic and cultural discourses. And I want to quote at length a piece from 1963 where Paik writes, and I'm quoting him here, "In usual compositions, we have first the approximate version of the completed work, the pre-imagined ideal or idea, in quotes and capitals in the sense of Plato. Then the working process means the torturing endeavor to approach this ideal idea. But in experimental TV, the thing is completely revised. Usually I don't or cannot, underlined, have a pre-imagined vision before working. First, I seek the way, in capitals, of which I cannot foresee what it leads to. The way, that means to study the circuit, to try various feedbacks, to cut some places and feed different waves there, to change the phase of waves, etc., these technical details I could explore. Anyway, just as a way of, what I need is approximately the kind of idea which American ad agency used to use. Just a way or a key to something new. This modern, with a question mark, usage of idea has not much to do with truth, eternity, consummation. Ideal idea, which Plato, Hegel ascribed to the celebrated classical terminology, idea equals Kunst ist die Erscheinung der Idee, art is the appearance of the idea, Hegel, Schiller. So art is the appearance of the idea. And I think Paik reflects a kind of intellectual exploration, a kind of struggle in graphic terms. If you look at this text, you'll see how he brackets, uses capital letters, breaks in the words, etc. He wrestles to express the energy of his transformative thinking as he was creating a new art practice, linking again, as I've mentioned, performance and interactivities with reworkings of sound and the electronic moving image. In Paik's work, there is also the added volatility of chance that he brings to the moving image. As he wrote in his notes about the 1963 exhibition, exposition of music, electronic television. Indeterminism and variability is the very underdeveloped parameter of optical art. The controlled velocity of change and chance shaped the metaphors that broke through the standard vocabularies of the moving image and all forms of his art making. For example, Paik's tapes break the sequential movement of film montage, the material of film and the way it's edited sequentially, with the more fluid motion of the electronic moving image for a kind of collaging variability and indeterminism that Paik was to explore in so many forms and genres across his career. So this idea of variability is articulated in his score, Symphony for 20 Rooms from 1961, again showing the connections between performance and his artworks and exhibition practices, where each space gives instructions for actions that vary by virtue of the participant. This is a score which tells you you're open to work in these spaces of the sequential score, which, like the various rooms in that exhibition that this anticipates in 1963, where he had rooms of TVs, rooms of prepared pianos, and where, as Namjoon wrote, in these pieces that were shown, Zen for TV, and I love this Rembrandt TV, it's a later version, both of these are later version. He said, 13 sets suffered 13 sorts of variation in their video, horizontal, vertical units. He said, I am proud to be able to say that all 13 sets actually changed their inner circuits. No two sets had the same kind of technical operation. I stress that for you. No two sets had the same kind of technical operation. I seem to be creating a soundtrack. Anyway, so as I talk about Namjoon's openness to process, it does not mean that he relinquishes, and this is very important, control of his artwork. Paik's playfulness is genuine, but is not thoughtless or undisciplined. It's not a freewheeling anarchism, a hit or miss approach. I remember many times being with Namjoon and his quick and precise stating of what he wanted and how it would work as a total piece, as a commission or as an installation in an exhibition. Jon Huffman will be examining this really largely unstudied aspect of Paik's work, how he transformed and engaged an exhibition space to show his artwork, whether it's the pavilion at the Venice Biennale or the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum. And I think this will shed further light on understanding his artwork as we discuss how Paik worked to install his work. So I've written about Namjoon being a global visionary and a bricoleur who gathered into his thinking as well as his studio ideas and traditions and avant-gardes of different cultures. And we see this in the archive. Tiarna mentioned this. In the material there were toys, folk sculptures, and other visual embodiments, videotapes, films of really humankind's cultural, social, and political memories. This is what he was looking at, gathering together. These were tactile materials that he could further integrate, transform as a visual artist, values from different parts of the world, which he brought into his studio spaces. And as I said, these became a resource for his restless quest to celebrate the world, which we see in his global satellite performances telecast around the world. Good Morning, Mr. Orwell. Fantastic, self-produced. I mean, this man produced, working with television stations and around the world to make this live performance happen. And there, the videos of folk dances, avant-garde film, performance, pop music, were all part of that process and that project. And then again, saying how he integrated all that in his videotapes into his single-channel tapes and then into his installations and sculptures. And I think all this is important to curators and conservationists, as this offers insight into understanding how he looked at his art and what he sought to achieve in specific pieces. Paik, like most artists, created in the present and was less concerned, not at all, with conservation as a means to freeze his work in a time and place. His life in art was about permanence and change.
a subtle understanding that saw TVs and monitors as interchangeable, that could see the details of a piece migrate into a different medium and format, from drawing to TV to flat screen. After all, his ideas and art were about the future, about change and mutability. Now, my published writings on Paik have been focused on the genres of his work, linking pieces formally, including music compositions, performances, interactive pieces, multi-monitor pieces, video walls, projection sculptures, closed-circuit pieces, multi-monitor media installations, single-channel videotapes, drawings, prints, paintings, assemblages. I mean, the range of work is astonishing. Today, I've suggested that we have to open up these categories and see them intertextually, looking closely to follow how images and concepts move through different genres and works. And I've argued for the importance of his writing and his ideas to his artwork and to understanding his working methods. And I'm pleased to be preparing with Edith Decker-Phillips and Greg Zinman an edition of Namjoon's collected writings. So to a new generation of curator and conservation specialists who may not have known Paik or seen much of his work during the artist's lifetime comes the challenge of addressing an artist who worked in many media disciplines, art forms. In other words, what were the many versions? Where were they shown? Who owns what? Questions that speak to the very issue of conservation that we're addressing here. What are we conserving? Who is interpreting the work? How is it being exhibited? What claims are being made for the decision, and what is guiding those decisions? On what evidence or authority is a decision being made? All of this being asked at a time when the artist is no longer with us. Now, the increasing attention being paid to conservation of time-based art is a growing phenomenon resulting from the pressure of museums on conservation departments as they both collect and present a history that includes the moving image work. As these institutions really have to anticipate how to deal with the future, reflecting, which I've often argued, the increasing pressure to rewrite the history of 20th century art through the moving image as we become a media culture. And I'm hoping that conservators come to Namjoon Paik's artwork understanding that in order for the work to be conserved, it needs to be considered as part of a complex story that I've only begun to describe. A story of artworks inspiring other pieces, that a work should be seen as made up of multiple parts, all of which support the whole piece. Understanding that each artwork has its special demands and has to be seen in terms of the goals set by the artist. I think the best advice is to consult and interview someone familiar with installing and studying the artwork and make that part of your written record on the artwork. And I would recommend you go to the Paik estate. Tiarna mentioned Ken Akuda and Jon Huffman who will be speaking, and ask for recommendations of people to interview. The estate represents the body of the artist's work, so it's an important source. The artist's intentions and the demands of that work demands on us are enormous, and we need to see conservation as a process with ongoing research and study bringing forward more information and knowledge. Conservation, as we all know from its history across many art forms and materials of art making, is controversial, and what appears as a definitive knowledge at one point in time comes under revision later. And you all have, conservators in this room, enormous, I think, really power. It's an opportunity, and I think it needs to be used creatively and in full dialogue with the curatorial and other resources and knowledge bases available to you. So in conclusion, the Paik Archive is essential to this research and is largely untapped. The archive display in the exhibition, if you haven't had a chance to take a look at that, because it is a kind of model for me of a strategy of representing Paik's artwork and methods of working, showing connections in this interactive process across a variety of materials and media technologies. And I would also recommend the preparations of a series of studies available in print and online, a database that can be shared by conservators addressing, and this probably exists in some form, but it's important that it addresses your questions by fully examining a representative range of Paik's work. in these working papers, which would help create a context and continuity across his entire body of work. I thought the recent report from Los Angeles Contemporary Museum of Art, we're going to hear from Jon Huffman later today, in the preservation of Video Flag Z, was really a fine example of a case study. So gatherings such as this are essential, and I applaud Tiarna and her team, an extraordinary group, for what I would describe in her leadership as an ongoing balanced investigation, a weighing of complex of issues and interests, and searching for answers rather than rushing to judgment. And finally, Namjoon was always a challenge to show in exhibition and to work with. But I learned more from him and was inspired by him more than any other artist I ever worked with or ever met over my long career. The depth of his knowledge and the integrity, I stress that, the integrity of his vision was an inspiration. And I hope his artwork inspires all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jon. Now, Jon has graciously agreed to stay with us on the stage in conversation with Jon Huffman. Jon Huffman is an artist based in San Francisco, and Jon Huffman spent 20 years working with Namjoon Paik. He has been the curator of the Namjoon Paik estate for 7 years, and Jon was extremely instrumental in helping us install our exhibition, and we have learned a tremendous amount from him. So please join me in welcoming Jon Huffman to the stage.
Thanks. You gonna set it up for me? Okay.
No, I want to be sure I'm in the right place.
So that was fantastic, the text you read of Namjoon's writings where he's speaking about exploring. And that carried on into his exhibitions, this aspect of exploring. This is a picture of Namjoon from 1991 from his dual exhibition, Video Time, Video Space. This is Basel Kunsthalle, and it was simultaneously installing at Zurich Kunsthaus. And exhibitions were always one of my most interesting times to work with Namjoon. He was very attentive, and I think he enjoyed the process. He was often in capital cities around the world, which he felt completely at home in. And so he's using this museum as a studio, creating works on site. Here he's painting a piece that later became titled Blind Buddha. And we spent so much time working in the space that they eventually just handed us the key, which is unheard of, really. I don't know which museum would hand a key over these days.
Not here.
And from the photos, I think you can see how dynamic Namjoon is, how much he is enjoying himself running this museum. And he would trot in with bags and bags of food to fuel the staff. And he'd bring us mega cappuccinos, and he'd plop down in the middle and direct us. And so his exhibitions would start with notebooks, sketches. He'd just imagine rooms. This is from the same exhibition. And new works, old works. And he'd just sketch them out simply, but be open to the installation process when he got on site. And this culminated, I think, with the Worlds of Nam June Paik in 2000, which he started thinking about in 1993 at the Venice Biennale. Tom Krantz approached Nam June, and they had a brief conversation. And Nam June said, I think I have a good idea. And so, since '93, very focused his attention on that show. And so, John, what did you think when Nam June
Oh my gosh.
said, I want to have a waterfall from the top ramp falling down?
This 7-story waterfall. Well, you know, John's made a couple of really important points, and that is, and it's very much the case with this exhibition as it was at the Whitney and other projects of working with Nam June. The museum, the exhibition, was the site to realize work. You know, it was the place to bring earlier pieces together, if it was retrospective, or was the opportunity to show new work, and to bring the institution behind it. And my conversations with Nam June after joining the Guggenheim, because obviously Tom Krantz saw that as part of what he wanted to realize as his millennial show, was this exhibition, The Worlds of Nam June Paik, and so brought me on board as a senior curator, and it began and continued conversations I was having with Nam June about this piece, about this exhibition. And, you know, Nam June would come up with ideas that were always fantastic, and what you had to do was bring the resources of the institution behind it. We had an extraordinary installation crew at the Guggenheim, which said, we can do this, John, we can realize this. And we were going to reopen a sculpture pond at the bottom, which hasn't been seen before. But to accommodate this work, and this is just a little bit of, is the museum had to really change its whole entryway because of the control of light and the presence of this, the waterfall with the monitors face up, because it was part of a piece called
Modulation and sync.
Modulation and sync, linking three-dimensionally this entire great space of Frank Lloyd Wright, the rotunda. And so when Nam June would sketch these out, whether it was in New York or Miami, I mean, he would make these drawings and with the waterfall, and it's going to do this and that. And then I would go in to talk to Tom Krantz, of course, and say, oh, Tom, I wanted to create this waterfall. And he would say, what? So I'll never forget, I had this meeting, and I said, it's going to be like this. It's going to be this waterfall. And it's going to be right down on the side of the rotunda. And, you know, it was a piece that really revitalized the space in terms of Wright's own ideas of continuity, of change, of everything organic and all that. And, of course, it was also an auditory work. I mean, you heard the water. And so when it was turned on, Tom's office was not far from the top ramp, and I said, Tom, you have to come out here and see this. And it was just, when it went on, bingo, totally worked. And, you know, that's all part of, as a curator, a belief one has, knowing an artist's work, and knowing the capacities of the institution and the resources that need to be brought to it. But often it's not just about resources, just understanding that it's going to work, that it's going to be fantastic. And it was this poetic centerpiece that, you know, it was quite extraordinary. But
for me personally, as an artist, I would be scared to death to attempt something like that. But Nam June was fearless in his
Absolutely.
premiering new works or creating works on site.
And he was so charismatic, and even in the late in life, I mean, the power of his ideas, the power of his thinking, his presence, his conviction, and the body of work behind him, that it just would carry the story forward. And there was no telling Namjoon, no, I don't think we can do this. No, we had to do it. And he was right.
For me, it was incredibly exciting when in the studio he would supply a list of what he wanted prepared for his coming laundry list of equipment, materials. And it was fantastic. He would arrive at the studio and start this exploration. He'd have an idea of a direction he was going to go in, but
When you say laundry, do you mean he had identified
like
particular...
I was with him when he created the first version of candle projection, and we met at his studio, and he said, provide 7 General Electric projectors, for instance, and 8, 10 in out VDAs, and a bunch of cables, and 4 or 5 cameras, and then he'd go in, and over a multi-day session, he would figure out how he wanted to
See, that's really interesting.
come up with a video sculpture.
And he was funding that and making that possible himself.
Yes.
That's really important. He was getting that material.
I mean, we'd often have lunch together, and he'd write out these lists for me. And most of his lists are costs of equipment
Yeah,
and
exactly.
and logistics. And
The archive has a lot of that,
and often the figures are completely
course.
reported.
That's surprising.
This is in the National Gallery in Seoul in
It was huge.
1993. Much smaller version. This is TV Garden in Seoul with candle projection.
Yeah, so you're looking down into a space with the garden, and then the flames licking up on the side walls.
So combining TV Garden
and yeah,
candle
very
projection.
nice.
Oops.
Oh, yeah,
That's at the National Gallery 2 years ago.
here in Washington. Very nice installation of the work. Oh, yeah, TV garden in the bays.
So that was a very unique example of TV Garden, putting it on the bays.
You see this here? How the garden, the plant goes over the bay, and if you could look at Wright's original drawings, he had plants. You know, I mean, the idea was that this was this organic, as I said earlier, form, and so it was fascinating to see how Paik sort of released something. I think a lot was learned in this installation in terms of light, as I just mentioned earlier, lightening up the spaces and bringing the moving image in. It's a fantastic environment.
TV Fish in Bilbao and TV Garden, different combinations.
That's right, different combinations. So you could maintain darkness with the garden and then walk around it with signature work and relationship to it. It's always interesting to make this conversation between pieces. And I think the deeper you get into them, the connections you can make become really interesting. And I think that's very important in the, as I was trying to say in my remarks, is individual pieces address multiple issues. And as a curator wants to put like TV Garden into an exhibition in relationship to media, or does one want to put it into an exhibition in relationship to some organic landscape issues? I mean, it requires then different ways of exhibiting it. It has different ways of being interpreted, and that's what's going to happen more and more with this work. there's one thing about one artist exhibitions. There's another when work is included in group exhibitions. And that really, I think is really exciting. That means, though, that in terms of conservation and curatorial is understanding the work well in terms of the content of the videos and the content of the idea behind it in terms of interpreting it. Do you have anything from the later, what other images? Do we go to? Oh, that's nice. Oh, that's great.
the same room.
Yeah.
It's really interesting,
That's very nice.
the videotape of Global Groove, Merce, and then using Merce in the TV Fish,
Yes,
the differences and similarities.
absolutely. That's largely, as I said earlier, largely unexamined, the content of the tapes.
Bays at the Guggenheim.
But it was very deliberate what he edited and chose for his sculptures and installations.
And upstairs.
Yeah, very nice. Yeah. Do you have Berlin?
No, I didn't put that in. I think that's the last slide.
This is here.
Yes, upstairs.
Nice place to end. Because of the relationship of the archive to the studio spaces, which were photographed by David Heel, the photographer at the Guggenheim. We used it in the Worlds of Nam June Paik catalog. And then, which are essentially the contents that we moved here, along with the idea of time, frozen but moving with TV clock, and then entering into that centerpiece work with the idea of the sky hovering over it. It was quite a process putting together this show. It's very interesting. It's tight space, and I was very pleased. We should open to questions.
Sure.
Or did you have something for?
I was just going to say, the degree of difficulty in showing his work after he's gone
Yeah.
is, I find most of the work is not that difficult to show. I think the more problematic work is representing his performances.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, the performance has become so important. I mean, it's being recognized again, and yet you really can't re-perform his pieces. And but there are ways that you can find. There is a great videotape archive that's going to find its way into the archive here. Now, a lot of the tapes that he used in installations, which I was referring to, and documents of performances, this kind of thing, which I think will be very helpful to you to use in relation as one is installing and wanting to represent performance of his performance-based work.
I find Joseph Beuys's installations were so much about his hand, and I don't find that as necessary in Nam June's work.
What do you mean?
Well, I think it's really difficult to install a Beuys piece because it's really Beuys seems to installing it, and the magic seems to be in that moment. In Nam June's work, his hand isn't really is integral into it.
Huh.
It's the best compliment he ever gave me is when he came to the Bilbao show and he said, "Oh, Mr. Huffman, I can die in peace now. You've interpreted my design like a Beethoven score."
Perfect.
And I mean, I could tell he was heartfelt relieved, and I was very relieved.
Exactly. A perfect note to end on.